Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm sorry I missed our meeting last Tuesday. As a reminder, I'm Cadence Petros. I'll be your facilitator this afternoon. And we'll start again. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to meeting 4 of the HOTAC. I'm glad you all were able to join us this afternoon. I'm sure others will join us as they're able to. My name is Cadence Petros. I'll be your facilitator, and with me today are Thea and Sean and Ingrid, and Maddie will be taking notes for DLCD. And we also have Love from OHCS. So thank you so much for state partners, and then for our other TAC members, grateful to have you here today. So last week was referral. I was able to watch the YouTube replay, and it was a very interesting conversation. Today, we're going to be talking about the audit portion of the housing acceleration process. And as a reminder, right, there's 3 parts. There's referral, which you talked about last week, audit, which we're talking about this week, and the acceleration agreement process itself, which we'll be talking about next time. So really the question in this week's meeting is all about what information does DLCD and its local jurisdiction really need to have in order to effectively enter into a housing acceleration agreement. So what is the information necessary for DLCD to appropriately provide technical assistance, to direct resources, and then to really effectively determine what actions, if any, are within the city's control that should be changed in that acceleration agreement. So that's the meat of what we're going to be talking about today. And before we start that, I'm going to turn it over to Thea to give a little bit more context.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cadence. And hi, everybody. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind you all to turn your cameras on if it's at all possible. We might remind you several times in this meeting. If we sound like a broken record on this, it's because when you watch on YouTube, you can only see the video participants, and it looks like we have a very, very tiny group of people here. And I just want to make sure that we're reflecting the full spectrum of input that we're getting within the TAC. So just a reminder, I want to take a minute to bring us back to center this conversation around the racial equity framework for decision making. And I'm going to share my screen just real briefly to talk through some of the elements of the racial equity framework that we see sort of emerging in this audit process conversation. We wanted to sort of, so you can see on this, they're all blue because they are all important. All of these elements are still important in this conversation. The darker blue ones are the elements that I think are kind of even more particularly relevant in this conversation today. And one of those that we wanted to draw out is benefits and burdens. Staff here and TAC members really need to keep in mind how the audit process can impact community members and the audited local governments. Considering especially, I think, scarcity of resources and how those are allocated within the communities with other priorities in the mix. That's one of the big factors that I want to make sure that we're keeping in mind. Going to community engagement, there is a required public process. And so local community members and implementation partners will have opportunities throughout the process to share feedback with DLCD. But I wanted to bring it back to the fact that we really need to design this to be targeted and responsive, particularly to underserved members of the community. Finally, both accountability and measuring outcomes are critical so that staff and TAC members can stay focused on sort of the historical lay of the land, how the state and local jurisdictions have sort of historically contributed to inequitable outcomes, intentionally or unintentionally. how we can be held accountable, and how to measure progress toward equity. So sort of with that framework in mind, I'm gonna stop the share and go back to the screen where I can see you all. We're gonna jump off, as Cadence said, from the conversation about the referral process to talk about sort of what happens once a city gets referred into the Housing Acceleration Program. So basically at that point, as you all know, DLCD jumps in to team up with the city, collaboratively spending about 6 months to identify barriers, to figure out what's making it tough to build homes here, and what's making it tough to keep homes affordable. To do this, of course, we'll conduct a deep dive. I want to say it's called an audit in the statute, but to be honest, we're not married to that language. And I think part of this conversation can be what we might want to call it. So this deep dive will look at everything from the city's housing goals to what developers and residents and other community members have to say. Also considering factors like the housing market itself, local policies, of course, the city's ability to sort of handle new construction, what funding is available. So all this information will be used to sort of feed into a housing acceleration agreement, which we'll discuss next time we meet. For now, I want to think together a little bit about how to approach this conversation about the audit process. When I think about it, I sort of break it down into 4 steps. Starting with identifying exactly what's required by the statute. So what's required of DLCD, of cities, and of other partners. And that's really what's in 197A.130.4, especially looking at A through J. Defining the parameters, the second step is sort of defining the parameters of that directive in the statute. So how extensive is it? How far does it go? And how narrow could it go? And then discussing what options exist within those parameters. I want to say there's sort of a fair amount of leeway within that conversation. And we can sort of call back the conversation about like the broad versus deep from the referral conversation that we were talking about last week. Also like issues of capacity, what's ideal versus what's possible. Where to focus the evaluation. Is it a full system approach or sort of targeting problem areas, which parties to include in the process and to solicit feedback from. So those are just some of the questions, and we'll get into a lot of that in the discussion. Finally, operationalizing those options with the racial equity lens and the statutory principles at the center. And I just want to bring us back to what those statutory principles are. Again, I'm going to drop this in the chat. Oops. Oh, seems I can't drop this in the chat, so I'm just going to read it to you. But you all know, you've all seen this written, and maybe Ingrid will post it in just a minute. 1, increasing housing production. 2, developing affordable and equitable housing. 3, forming partnerships with cities and other public bodies, state agencies, special districts, whatnot. D, responding proportionately to housing under production. E, escalating enforcement when it's necessary to address persistent non-compliance issues. And finally, considering the availability of state resources. So those are sort of the principles that are in the statute that we need to be responsive to. I think sort of with that background, I want to turn it back over to you all. I really want to hear where you're at with this. I think that as Cadence pointed out, we did kind of start getting into this conversation last week. So I know that your brains are all in this already. Before I hand it to Sean, though, just wanted to do one more reminder that if you can possibly have your cameras on, that would be great. And yeah, I think that's it. Any questions before we get started? Yeah, Al.
Thea, would you mind just very quickly doing that list of 4 things one more time? just so it sticks.
Yeah, and this is just how I'm thinking about it. I want to acknowledge that everybody as they approach this have kind of different ways to break this down. But for me, identify what's in the statute is the first step. Then sort of define the parameters of that directive. So where we're bracketed, where the work is. Then discuss the options that exist within those parameters. So how much flexibility is there within the statute that we can sort of talk about here, different alternatives that exist. And finally, the fourth is how to operationalize those options with both the racial equity lens and the statutory principles at the center to make sure that those are sort of the highlighted features of the options that we're coming up with. And I do want to say, I don't expect that we'll get to operationalizing these today, but that's sort of the general goal we need to by the end of this rulemaking process. So we're going to start that conversation here. Does that make sense, Al? Okay. All right. Anybody else before we get started? All right, Sean.
Great, yeah, and I'll just kind of set us up with the context before we start moving into talking through the questions. So just a reminder on the process. And Cadence, I see you came off mute if you wanted to chime in with something. I don't know if you were. Oh, okay. But just like a reminder, so last meeting we had kind of our first, maybe exploratory conversation specifically around the referral process. Now we're in that second component, which is the audit process. The third component is going to be that housing acceleration agreement, right? What we do about it. And, the intent really is not to like solve these problems, but just to start thinking through some considerations, maybe start thinking through some potential options that we can take over. We have a meeting on the 30th with the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. And really our goal there is to try to have a productive policy conversation. What's the direction that we should take with the things that are kind of in our control or in our statutory authority that we are rulemaking on, right? And then we'll kind of come back and we'll start thinking through some more specifics. All right, what do the specifics of the process look like, right? That type of thing. And in the context of the audit, there are some things that they tell us that we have to do, all right? Once we do the referral process, which we have to do annually, we know the cities that are referred into it, which, we know that that's going to take more conversation to land on. Once we know that, we have this directive to essentially, within 6 months, conduct an audit of the potential barriers that could be inhibiting housing production, affordability, and choice in that community. And there's some things that we have to do that the statute lays out. For one, obviously, we're going to have to communicate with the city, but we also have to open a period of kind of, public comment and opportunity for other folks, interested parties to be able to kind of provide feedback to DLCD. So we have to have some type of mechanism for that. We have to conduct essentially an audit of barriers. We have to produce some kind of outcome by the end of this that's like, here are the barriers that we've identified. And then there's a pretty long list of things that we have to consider as we go through that audit process. And actually, a lot of these were things that were raised in that last process. I think we heard a lot of this idea that, we want the certainty and clarity on whether we're in the housing acceleration program or not. But we also think it's important to dive into the context. Like, what is the city's housing production strategy? What's going on the ground? And really, a lot of the factors that are required to be considered are part of that, like they're spelled out explicitly in the audit process. And actually, I'm going to share my screen really quickly just so we can look at a list of this. Last week, we shared a policy brief. Apologies, we didn't have it ready the week prior. We were still kind of working on that polish before sending it out. But it includes a list of the things that like the statute says we have to consider all of these different things. But then there's kind of some questions beyond that that are within our control. Like, what does the actual process look like? Like, how do we deliver, like notice? Who is involved? Who do we invite to the table? We can actually invite OHCS to do a concurrent review. So when is that important to do? How do we interface with other public bodies, right? Including, say, like special districts, other state agencies. The product, what do we actually deliver at the end of the process? Is it like the barriers, different considerations? What does it look like? those are the things that we have kind of within the parameters of our kind of control or statutory authority to be able to explore in these conversations, right? So this first conversation, we really want to try to structure it, right? Let's get set up for the policy conversation. What values and principles do we want to make sure are embedded in this audit process? And then in a future meeting, we'll start talking through some of those more mechanical nuts and bolts details. Of course, feel free to raise them here too. We can always transfer that over to the next one. But I'm going to start by sharing my screen because I think this is going to be a pretty important maybe framing for what we are supposed to be looking at. So like as part of the audit process, right, they say essentially, you're going to be doing an evaluation, and at the end of this, at the end of this 6-month period, you incorporate all the feedback and you have to publish essentially the results of your audit. And you have to consider all of these different things. So one is the housing production strategy that the city has adopted, along with any associated materials that were, say like things in the public record, right? So you consider the HPS, right? What did the city say they will do and what have they done as part of this audit process? It's like top line. The second piece, obviously, we have to have that process where we solicit public comments and feedback from a variety of different parties. We should talk about who should be at the table, but we have to include this, right? We're considering this as part of the overall audit process. And then we have to do some kind of local evaluations, like what are the regulations relating to local planning and development, right? Obviously, zoning code, development code barriers, thinking about that broadly and holistically. Obviously, processes involved in permitting, right? What are the different, procedural steps that are associated with housing production, that type of thing. Obviously, fees, exactions, and requirements for, say, public facilities improvements. And then, of course, in relationship to equity specifically, there are kind of what are the actions or inactions related to fair and equitable housing outcomes, environmental justice, climate resiliency, that type of thing. And then we start looking at some of the things that are beyond kind of what the local government does and beyond into kind of the state realm, maybe federal realm, like the things that are, or even just market realms, the things that are starting to get outside of that local government's control. We start looking at deficiencies in local capacity, funding, infrastructure, or land. Like what resources is the local government working with? We start looking to what are the potential resources at the state level that could support production overall, right? Like, is there an ODOT facility that has a deficiency? Are there, existing resources for, say, like sanitary sewer, right? That's where we can start looking at those pieces. And then we start also looking at the related policies, right? If you are a jurisdiction where water is handled by a special district, what are their policies? You don't have control over that, right? And then, of course, there's also policies of other state agencies, say, for example, state wetlands by DSL. We have to consider those as part of this audit process. And then, of course, finally, what are the other potential factors that may lie beyond the control of the local government? Examples obviously include things like if we hit a recession, right? That's obviously a big consideration that would be part of that, right? So this is where we start diving down, and the specific requirements of the audit require DLCD to start considering that nuance. Right. And so one of the kind of core questions that we want to ask, like top line, as we're starting to think about how we operationalize this process, is really about that structure, right? We do, it tells us that we have to do this audit process. It tells us we have 6 months. It tells us all these different parameters, but within our control, we do have some, decisions that we need to make about what that process looks like, who's invited to the table, and who do we get involved in the audit process, and what does that make sense, as well as what we actually deliver as an outcome of that audit. And what our goal is, in line with the legislative direction, is we want to structure this to be collaborative and effective, right? At the end of this, we should have a pretty good set of things that we can follow up on with, state agencies, with the local government, to really start working to address some barriers, right? We've done the contextual deep dive, and we have some good next steps that we can take to meaningfully address some of the barriers that are identified. And the goal is to make it, as collaborative and as effective as possible, right? So within that, let's start just broadly talking about structure. How should we start thinking about the audit process structure to foster this kind of legislative intent for both collaboration and, of course, taking action to address barriers? And of course, within that too, we also kind of pose some additional sub thoughts in there, right? We at DLCD, we're going to have to think about local resource deficiencies. We'll have to think about TA and grant resources, that type of thing. And then we also have to think about how this feeds into the acceleration agreement later, right? How do we make this useful for that next piece of the equation, the acceleration agreement, to ensure that it is effective and that we're actually taking meaningful actions on the local and state government side to address barriers. So with that, I'm going to open it up. I want to see what you guys are all thinking on broadly on the structure of the audit process and what you guys think it should achieve and how we can translate this to the RAC to have a fruitful policy discussion. So feel free to jump in. Yeah, Sam.
So this is maybe a small thing, but could end up being significant. I know, you know, cities are first start being kind of eligible to be referred at that 3 or 4 year midpoint of the HPS. And I have already noticed a number of HPSs that put a lot of their more significant strategies into the second half of that period. For legitimate reasons, you know, whatever. It is kind of getting pushed back, and I'm wondering how DLCD will kind of account for that if you have, you know, cities that end up by the criteria end up being eligible for referral, and they say, well, hold on, our more significant strategies are coming in a year, 2 years, 3 years. Because I think it could go either way, where there's kind of bad faith reasons for that, but also, you know, legitimate reasons that need to be considered.
No, that's really interesting. I'd be interested to hear some perspective from practitioners. I know folks here are either in the process of working on housing production strategies or have adopted them. Let's get some dialogue going on that.
I think we're struggling with that. I think it's a balancing between sort of, we can predict what we're working on next year, next fiscal year, maybe the year after that. And then after that, it gets uncertain. And I think for some of the bigger lifts, you need the resources, you need the political support to even just undertake the project. So, you know, at this level, I think what you see reflected there is sort of the uncertainty around staff or the city manager versus a council statement, right? That it's hard to look that far out. And it's hard to really commit to a big lift until you're ready, you know, you got the political support to really tackle that issue. So I think you're seeing a little bit of both of that in how people are sequencing those actions.
No, thank you for that, Tom. Yeah, Michael, please feel free.
That makes total sense, Tom. Is it possible that, I mean, I guess in my ideal vision for the HPS would itself become a more important political process, where the buy-in in the HPS process would be that politically important debate, and that in this current round, without Ona's teeth involved, it makes sense that wouldn't necessarily. But like I would hope that in future processes, we would be deliberately moving some of that political buy-in to the HPS composition.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, Tom, did you want to respond to that?
Oh, totally agree. I mean, this is a new thing, a new tool. I don't know that councils are necessarily paying attention, or what is this, or how do I do this? And same with sort of the bureaucracy, right? It's something new, and so I think it can be what Michael's talking about over time, become that forum for the dialogue about what is it that we're doing. I think the 3-year progress reports are going to be a moment there, and we should talk about, like, that progress report has to go to the Planning Commission, the council, before it goes to DLCD, and making that sort of an explicit political check-in. And then the feedback that comes back from DLCD with respect to that progress report, and sort of checking the box, like, have we really talked about that feedback with our council, and what does that mean, and how do we make adjustments to work programs?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, Al.
It was really kind of a question following up on what Tom was saying. I just noticed that City of Eugene has just come out with its annual monitoring report. Is that the same thing as a progress report? And is that the kind of thing that we're using to, use as part of the audit, or we incorporating into the audit some of the self-auditing that's going on by the various jurisdictions? And will that depend pretty much on, the size of the jurisdiction, or, how can we incorporate into this some of the things that are kind of already there?
If I could speak to the statutory requirement. So as part of the HPS program, one of the requirements that every city does is at the midpoint, there's essentially a check-in, right? They submit a report to DLCD. They describe, all right, we're at the midpoint in our process. We said we would do these different things leading up to this point. Here's where we're at implementation on these different things. These things were successful, or these things, stalled, that type of thing. And there's kind of a process by which we check in, and we're saying, are you actually, taking actions to address the needs? Are you responding to these fair and equitable housing outcomes? How's implementation going at this midpoint cycle? So that's what's currently in rule. And so one of the things that we could consider as part of this is, if we have a subset of jurisdictions that are doing, right, this process, obviously this is going to be an important kind of check-in document for the audit process. So we can think through how that gets ingratiated or incorporated into the audit process, if it does. Yeah.
And I'll just add quickly to your point, Al. I think one of the other elements that we should consider in this conversation is how, what we can expect in terms of partnerships from the cities. Is like, when, do we want that self-auditing? Is that self-audit going to be a part of part of the process? Is it, or maybe, like sort of you're suggesting, maybe like just for certain cities that have capacity to do that kind of work, or are already implementing that kind of work, cities that are producing that already, can, when does that get brought in to the consideration? So I think that's absolutely up for discussion here.
We have that's very helpful. We do have sort of a history of having some de facto auditors, watchdogs, like Thousand Friends has been both on housing as well as rural lands, that kind of thing. We have housing land advocates. I'm imagining the Urban League, NAACP, other groups will be kind of looking at this process as it goes on. And I don't know if we want to think about, where they fit into it, and how that aligns with the more or less official public self-audit process.
And it's worth mentioning, right? One of the statutory requirements is to essentially publish that we are doing an audit, and that there's an opportunity for kind of public comment, for people to be involved. So one of the things that we can talk about is, what does that look like, right?
Yeah.
How should that be structured?
Exactly. What is the sort of letting people know that there is an audit going on? But then another kind of corollary question is, are there interested parties that DLCD should proactively do outreach to solicit feedback, right?
Yeah.
There's the, come if you will, and then there's a specific ask. And I think that's a relevant question for discussion today, but also with the RAC and then in rulemaking.
Awesome. Yeah, Matt, feel free.
Yeah, just kind of on a related sort of issue, the list of things that you are being asked to look at with an audit, as you mentioned earlier, is extensive. I mean, that's really putting it pretty mildly. One of the issues that we talked about last time, I think somebody asked hypothetically, how many communities, how many cities do we think might end up being audited in any given year? This is going to happen every single year. How many low performing cities do we anticipate that we're going to have? And then I think, I'm just trying to think through this. I think there needs to be a way to kind of determine the level of audit or how much you're doing with the audit, at least at the very beginning, with the level of non-compliance, of deficiency that you're looking at. And so when you talk about structure, I mean, I think that's one of the things that would be useful to get at, because you're going to have to sort of triage this, I think. I mean, I have no idea how many communities are going to end up falling into this audit process potentially, and maybe there are only a few, and then you're able to really get into it. But if you're not, if you have 4 or 5, and this audit has to be completed in 6 months, and you're incorporating potentially a lot of stakeholder input, hopefully, we're just talking about proactively reaching out to stakeholders who might have something to say. And one question that I had, and it's, again, this is not in the legislation, how does a city challenge the findings of an audit if the audit's produced in 6 months and then we go straight to the housing accelerator agreement? All of this stuff just takes a lot of time. I'm just thinking about this from the standpoint of, land use decisions. And this isn't a land use decision. Explicitly, it's not according to the statute. But still, I think that, there's a lot of process involved here, and there's got to be a way to kind of figure out what you can get done easily early in the audit process, so that what you're auditing is the stuff that's actually meaningful for the deficiency, the problem that you're trying to cure, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, and definitely that trade-off of, depth versus breadth is kind of perennial to this particular process. Like, there's only so many staff resources and time to dive into it. I think the other question, you asked something on the statute itself, like what is the process for escalation, essentially? And the way it's structured is essentially, when the audit's produced, it's not a land use decision. It's not like an appealable decision in the same way that our approval or remand or approval with conditions of a housing production strategy is not remandable. From that point, there's essentially a 6-month process in which we work with the city to develop a housing acceleration agreement that is based on the audit. And if we fail to reach that, then it goes to LCDC, right? That's when we enter that particular process. And of course, if LCDC makes a decision, that can be appealed to the Court of Appeals. Does that get at your question?
It does. I mean, I just think that's a lot to do in a year.
Oh yeah, that part is not timed in a year. So LCDC happens so 6 months audit, right? 6 months to develop an agreement. If we fail to reach an agreement, that's when we move to LCDC.
Yeah.
So that's essentially, there's a time after that you go through the LCDC enforcement order process. If there was disagreement about what that entailed, then you take it up to the Court of Appeals. I think the point is, obviously, this is a process that involves kind of, a process between local governments and state governments, right? In terms of, there's going to be obviously a lot of collaboration built in, but also one of the principles is not to the exclusion of expedient use of enforcement power, right? That is also explicitly part of the statutory principles that are included in there. And so one of those is, if we're spending all of our time dealing with challenges to things, that's not very effective in actually achieving the outcomes, right? So that's essentially the process that it kind of sets forth.
Yep, Sean, I think what I'm also hearing from Matt, though, is just the audit and the agreement negotiation process itself to complete within 1 year's time frame is a lot. And that it can be more complicated if the city disagrees with the audit findings. And so maybe a question for this group to discuss in the RAC also is, what if any sort of draft findings discussion does DLCD and the jurisdiction have, so that maybe you can together kind of talk through areas of disagreement before the findings are made final and then become the basis of the negotiation for the agreement.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I'm talking about. Because if you wait 6 months to get to a point where we have something that seems like it's kind of final, and then you start trying to negotiate with the city or, you know, resolve whatever differences that, you know, you have through that agreement. If you spend that time kind of going back and contesting the audit, then that's time that's wasted getting to the housing acceleration agreement. That makes sense.
I'm just, yeah, I think that, like, well, we're gonna talk about the acceleration agreement process next week. But I do think that, so I guess, are you suggesting that the way that we structure it, the city needs to sort of, we really do need to ensure that there's a partnership with the city all the way through. So you don't get to this point where like you're sort of at loggerheads and it's like the end of the process, or you're just pointing out that there's a potential there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, as quickly as you can get to the audit, whatever that document is, or some draft or something like that, that I think that that's really important, so that, you know, by the time you're done with the 6 months, you have sort of an agreement with the city essentially that you're going to move into this next phase and figure out what you do from there. And it's not at 6 months you're still kind of contesting what the audit said. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, should we go to the hands?
Michael.
To your points, Matt, I think they're well taken. I wonder if it would be possible to take some of that A through J complexity and speed things up to some extent by like having like a clearly predefined list of things that, like, if DLCD is establishing that this is how we're going to evaluate item C, item E, or whatever, like some of those could be pretty automatic and predictable, potentially simplifying the process and also making it more transparent so the city knows what they're going to be getting when the document comes back. And then another question about the outreach thing about it's possible that all local process is going to be more thickly robust. So like some standards for what the local permit or like process notification, does it go to planning commission? I don't know what all. At the local level might be a way to get more of the local groups involved.
Gus.
I was thinking about the different reasons one might be referred into the acceleration program, and they're pretty different. I mean, if you've adopted an HPS and you're 3 or 4 years in, I think it'd be great, the conversation so far, if cities are doing a report, it's structured around what we might look at in an audit so that you're already kind of aligning progress, right? But if you're referred into the program because you didn't adopt your HPS, it's kind of different than if you adopted it and you're trying to make progress. So, I mean, I think they're a little bit different. There may be different levels of audit depending on where you are and why you were referred into it. And I'm not trying to make it more complicating, but I do feel like a city not following through or adopting stuff is a little different than a city that has adopted an HPS and then 3 years into it, they're working on stuff. And the only other thought while I've got my mic on is I was thinking about all the equity indicators and looking at the data and ability to get data that's meaningful to show your progress within 3 years when your, census data is already so dated. You might get information about, you might be able to figure out who rented a place or bought a place from your nonprofit partners. But I'm just thinking about the accuracy of that data to start as our measuring point, and then as we're reporting, especially trying to achieve those equity indicators, how we're going to look at that. Thank you.
So Gus, let's go back to you and then to Al.
Thank you. I just wanted to add on to what Matt said and Michael. I think that, and I hope I'm wrong, but I think we're all going to be surprised by the level of inability for cities to really get traction with this. And I think that, at least I hope that what we can do is put monitoring in effect quickly and be able to have some way of identifying progress, and then possibly other cities and communities can glom onto that mechanism. Forgive me, I have the kind of from the bottom up perspective, being kind of in the industry I'm in, and trying to get on top of the top down approach. But it's a very real perspective, because when you actually get to the point where you know the problem as a city, and then you are going to try to attract a builder, developer, investor, or whatever into your community, I think the reality of that sets in, and then time has passed, and then we're trying to really keep up with the problem as it worsens. And so I really think that accountability quickly and often, and being able to help each other as communities find ways to do that is important. So I guess I would just end with a question. How many cities or communities that we have kind of in this meeting think they actually have a grasp on this and are going to be able to tackle this thing with reasonable success?
Cities? Thoughts? Anybody want to respond? I mean, I think, Gus, one of the things that your question brings up is, I would imagine all the jurisdictions are doing what they consider to be quite a lot, or at least as much as they think is reasonable that they can do right now. And the question is, will the accountability program agree with that and think that other things are also within a city's control? And I think that's the nut of the question that this program over time is going to have to answer. And what is the help that cities are going to need in order to do that? Whether it's political cover, whether it's technical assistance, whether it's the additional resources, like you mentioned, best practices, all of those pieces I think will probably come into play.
Yeah, real quickly, I think one of the things that I think is important is that we're all in this problem together, and we have as a city, I heard it said once that cities, they don't like to run with scissors, right? Because what would happen? But I think about the problem that we have that we're trying to dissect. It's kind of the result in my mind of not running with scissors a little bit. So I'm just really of the attitude of let's act quickly and swiftly, and so thank you.
Yeah, hope there's some ER docs around. Al, please, you're up next.
Okay, thank you. I was just thinking about the history that I have on kind of all sides of this audit process, which has had a lot of different forms over the years. And one of the problems that keeps coming up is that you can get to 90%, and then that last 10% issue somehow manages to throw the whole thing, into a logjam. We've got that problem with the middle housing ordinance appeals here in Eugene. We had it with the Bend urban growth boundary appeal. So I think one thing we could think about, is how to structure this in such a way that if it turns out that we're getting toward the end of that 6 months, and you've got 4 or 5 issues that you still have to sort out, that shouldn't stop the whole process just because you're going into mediation on that issue or one issue. To the extent that you can make things severable and prove as much as you possibly can, you lose a little bit of leverage, but on the other hand, you maintain continuity and perhaps a sense of collaboration. So I think we need to think really about ways of making sure that we're not don't have to get out the plumber's friend too often.
Thanks, Al. Sam.
Yeah, spinning off of something that Anne said, and that I was already thinking about is staffing. We already have seen cities who are off of the HCA HPS schedule, and the reason that I've heard from them is staffing. And if they're already getting referred because of staffing issues, and then are going to be expected to participate in an audit, then I can already see, probably more than we're anticipating right now of cities who not only are getting into audit situations because of staffing issues, but then also are not able to fully participate or remedy the issues, come to some kind of acceleration agreement because of ongoing staffing issues. And so I do think that kind of has to be accounted for now, because I think it's going to come up probably more than we're expecting we're at this point.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so then a question will be, what does technical assistance look like? How does DLCD direct its resources that are available? Does it go towards staffing? Does it go towards staffing in the interim with an expectation in the acceleration agreement that the city will dedicate more resources going forward? I think all of those components are really interesting questions, because you're right. If you're already behind, and that's why you're referred, it's going to be very difficult to kind of dig yourself out of that hole during a 6 to 12 month audit and acceleration agreement process.
And I think that's also where we can lean to in that direction for this kind of proportionality, right? The point of the acceleration agreement is that it's proportional and commensurate, right, with like a city's capacity, right? So if we do that audit, we're like, why didn't you adopt your housing production strategy? It's like, oh, because we are between planning directors and they were our only person on this project, right? That is contextual, like that's something we can contextualize in the audit process and be like, all right, we need to, this is like step one, right? We need to work on this. Then of course, obviously get into the actual housing production strategy itself and everything therein.
Yeah, I think Sean's point, just kind of highlights how, to me, when I think about it, I don't see how we take the discretionary elements out of this, like how we enter into this, and that it's going to be really important to use context, for each case. I think that introduces a sort of set of complexities that we'll have to grapple with in these conversations and as we write the rules. But in order to respond proportionately to specific cities' specific needs and the rainbow of barriers that they face, they're thinking through what can be sort of systematic and what needs to be discretionary is one of the big questions for this group, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Thea. Matt.
Speaking of technical assistance, I know that this is one of the things that would kind of get worked out in the agreement after the audit. But it seems to me, like if it is maybe the case where you suspect or you think that the problem has to do something with like a regulatory issue, if there were a way to kind of like for there to be an off-ramp to technical assistance, so that you could, so that somebody could do a code audit and it wouldn't be staff, DLCD staff, doing that, because it's a lot of work. If there's a way to do that and kind of divert, somebody with substance abuse disorder, you divert them away from something that's punitive and something that's more rehabilitation, and again addressing that sort of workload issue that I think you're going to face. And what Anne said earlier, I think makes a lot of sense. I mean, if there's a situation where there's like one of these obvious cases where somebody hasn't adopted an HPS yet, or there's something like that, not that, they're intentionally doing something wrong, but I mean, those are just situations where, there's a bright line and, they've crossed it or haven't crossed it, and that can be dealt with. If there's any opportunity for that, if there's an opportunity for using other resources that we're eventually going to use anyway through that acceleration agreement, if they could be used earlier, I think we might be doing everybody a favor. So
yeah, and we'll talk through too. There's that like offering this idea of like specified technical funding and resources, really that message of support. That's like all about like what the housing acceleration agreement's about, which will be kind of part of that third conversation. We'll have a deep dive into like what do we focus on in terms of like how we structure that to kind of facilitate, right? Always thinking like making it the easiest choice, right? To like making collaboration the easiest choice, right? And providing that off ramp. So yeah, we'll talk about that more too as we move on. But thank you for the comment.
Yeah, Sean, it was an interesting question about whether in advance of the acceleration agreement, though, some of that technical assistance money could be directed. And if so, like what would the mechanism for that be? Because that's the acceleration agreement seems like that is the mechanism for deploying TA and resources.
Well, and then there's also that question too of timing, because 6 months is not enough time to execute and fulfill a contract. Actually, I mean, I could just say that outright as somebody who's been doing contracting for 4 years. But there's also that question of like, does it have to be done in 6 months, or is it like, oh, there's this evaluation of code, there might be some kind of preliminary things that warrant a deep dive. Maybe one of the things that happens after is a code audit and amendment process, right, with specified technical assistance.
Right, exactly. All right, Tom.
Yeah, I think this builds on a couple of different themes, but like last meeting, we were talking about best effort, and is the city making a best effort? And then there's something in there about the HPS, like is the HPS implementing best practices? Are you doing enough kind of thing? And that gets sort of to the discretionary end of things. I really like Matt's idea about sort of preemptive action, like you're headed in this direction. How can we take early corrective action or support cities doing more before it gets into this referral and sort of crisis stage kind of thing? But just thinking about how we can get back to the previous discussion in the last meeting about what constitutes a best effort or a best practice, and that having, is the city taking action? Are the actions really best efforts, or are they just trying to do the minimum necessary and they're sort of intentionally coming up short because of local politics or whatever? And I know that's hard to judge, but I think it's an important factor to keep in mind in all of this.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting questions in that is, if I'm doing 7 of 10 possible things, but my numbers are still not good, are there other things I can or should be doing? And will I be held accountable for doing that? I mean, that's one of the questions out there, I think.
Well, and I think that depends, and it gets into that last criteria, like what's going on in the rest of the world, right? Our interest rate's still at 8%. We've done what we can, right? Or we put an affordable housing bond issue on the ballot. The voters said no. Okay, we'll try again in 2 to 4 years. I mean, there's certain things like we tried. That is a best effort.
Right. But then Michael, I think in our first meeting said, but are voters part of the city? And then what, right? I mean, I'm not saying that I think that that's something that should be used, but it did startle me a little bit when he raised that. And I thought it was an interesting question. Anne.
Yeah, I really agree with what Matt and Tom have said. I like that off-ramping idea, that technical support to develop the HPS, but also to implement it is really, really important, so that you can have those successes and deal with that and try to sort of what Gus was saying is we need to start early and address those that need to get things rolling. How do we help them? Because I'll just give you the example in our city. We're about 57,000 people. I am the long range planner. I share a person with current planning. So if current planning is really busy, I'm not getting 40 to 50% of that person, and it's choppy, and it is time consuming to comply with all the regulations, and those are continuing. Maybe this will be the pause button for a little while, and we won't have any more new regulations. But I do think it's important that technical assistance is there, and I know that was the intent, and there was money allocated, but it seems like when you look at how many cities there are and the amount of money that's been allocated for these HPSs, and it's over time. I mean, ours isn't due for quite a few years. That it's important that, I know you need DLCD staff, but the cities need the resources in order to actually make a difference on the ground, rather than the money going to monitoring our progress. We need help to make that meaningful difference moving forward.
Before referral. All right, Daisy.
Hi there. Thank you for this discussion. I was just to kind of piggyback on what has been said. I was just going to voice that I'm hearing a need for technical assistance within the HNA, HCS, HPS process. And that is one of the things that, having worked in California in the housing element process down there, I worked with cities across San Mateo and Santa Clara County. So that is some very large cities, very small cities, very wealthy cities, so much poorer cities. And I think what works well in the California process is that there is funding for technical assistance for these cities, especially the small ones that have perhaps one long range planner. And so in that case, if you don't have in-staff, in-house capacity, there's at least money from the state to work with a consultant. And I guess my question for DLCD is, other than, I think you call them housing navigators, what resources will be available to jurisdictions, or are being made available to jurisdictions throughout the HCA, HNA, HPS process?
Yeah, so there's a few important things. One is in the statute, which is the idea that, if the audit process results in like a need to take local actions, DLCD has to step in with like technical assistance, right? That is part of it. Like the actions that come out of the housing acceleration agreement, they have to be proportionate to a city's capacity, and it has to be paired with that DLCD funding. That is a requirement of statute. But then also more broadly than that too, there's this backdrop of, if there are mandates that exist in state law and there isn't funding associated with supporting that, it is essentially defunct. It's the unfunded mandate provision of the Oregon Constitution, and it has like certain requirements that has led to a lot of different mandates falling by the wayside. The most notable of which in the DLCD realm was mandatory periodic review. But that's also true for the housing pieces, right? We have these requirements to regularly do housing planning once every 6 or 8 years, including the housing capacity analysis and housing production strategy. We have obviously this piece, which can require other types of local actions. Obviously, there's other bills that come out that say, thou shalt middle housing or XYZ. All of those have to be funded in order to do the work. Otherwise, they are an unfunded mandate and do not need to be implemented under the Oregon Constitution. So those are the two factors that play into here. One is the statutory element that requires DLCD step up with those provisions they're provided, which of course are contingent on the legislative appropriations. But then the second piece too, really being that broader constitutional framework.
Thank you. Michael.
To clarify on that ballot measure scenario, I realized that Tom's example of like the voters don't pass a specific funding ballot measure was what people might have thought I meant. I wasn't thinking of that scenario. I was thinking of a scenario where the voters pass some ballot measure designed to kill a project or something like that. But I think it's a legitimate question. I just think it's a different one than the one I was thinking about. Let's see. on the question of technical assistance and like a city knows that it could do better, but it just needs some technical assistance, I will just specify like my own pet goal is trying to get more land that has apartments legal on it, LIHTC scale apartment buildings. And it seems to me that if there's a very clear standard that the city is off the hook on one aspect of its audit in advance, that the city will be able to do that one time, and then that'll be an easy checkbox in like the city's done what it can in the future. And I would assume that same standard, that sort of standard, could be used for other policy measures as well.
Thank you. Thank you for the clarification. Sam.
Yeah, so in the housing production strategies that we've seen so far, and and this is probably not the venue to relitigate how we do housing production strategies or anything like this, but there are some interesting ways that a couple cities have acknowledged uncertainty, political risk or things like that. I think, and there were a couple strategies that Monmouth had where they said there's a reasonable risk that this is going to run into some significant community resistance. Medford, I thought, had a really interesting strategy where they put kind of political education, for lack of a better word, as one of their strategies, where it was, kind of training for people to overcome community resistance. So yeah, I wonder if there are things like that should be that can be the proactive piece, is that we acknowledge some of these uncertainties and have contingency plans built into the HPS so that we're less likely to get into the lack of follow through part of it. Because I don't want to disincentivize cities from being ambitious in how they address their housing needs, but then having some backup plans when those initial strategies verifiably run into issues and fall apart. Things that they can fall back on. I think maybe that's a way to avoid some referrals.
And I'll add, actually, that is built into the housing production strategy program. That was one of the considerations that happened in the first rulemaking process, which was this idea that we don't want to disincentivize folks from being ambitious, but that also means that sometimes there's going to be policy ideas that fall through the cracks. And the way that we were able to address that was essentially designing the rule to say, get all your ideas out there, be ambitious. If you don't implement something, that's not necessarily the end of the world. The main thing is you have to make sure that the need is being addressed, either through a plan B that you might have. It might be a series of other strategies that address that same need. You're not putting all your eggs in one basket, right? And then if you don't have that, then you have to kind of propose an alternative. Like, how are you going to make sure that that need is addressed, right? Because even if you have the ballot measure that fails, that does something, that doesn't mean that the need goes away, right? And so what is that plan B? And so that we can structure, obviously, the accountability program around that framework. It'll probably take a little bit more rigor because the HPS program was designed to say, all right, now you tell us what the plan B is, right? And intended to do that at the midpoint process, but there might need to be some thinking about how we structure that, of course, to avoid unnecessary referrals for cities that are being very ambitious and aggressive with their strategies. We want to encourage that.
Thanks, Sean.
Yeah, Ariel.
And I'm sorry, I've had to be a little bit in and out of this meeting. Are the rules going to define what we consider within or without a city's control, like the ballot measure example, and how that triggers the accountability process or not? Is it going to get that specific, or is that going to be kind of up to the department, and that there's going to be this kind of ambiguity and the city's not going to know until they go through the audit process?
It's actually a good question. So within and outside of control, the question is like, how do you want to define it too, I think is a question. So it's one of the themes that plays through the entire process, is that we're focusing on really trying to evaluate barriers that are inside and outside of a local government's control, providing support on the things that are outside, and of course, obviously, where there are factors that are inside control, right, including those provisions. I think one thing that we would need to consider is like, do you operationalize and provide? I think it requires certainty, right, rather than discretion. But do you provide that certainty through something like a rigorous definition? Do you provide it via like what the outcomes of the audit process are in terms of maybe you evaluate every barrier and then you do an evaluation of like, here are the factors that are inside control, here are the factors that are outside of control, here are the, all these different pieces, and try to evaluate it that way? I don't know. That's one of the decisions that we have the ability to make in this rulemaking process.
Yeah, I think that's an important one to think about. And then kind of maybe slightly different, but related, are there going to be situations where DLCD has a different opinion than the city about what is the right path or what is possible? And I think we've talked in previous meetings about, what a city is getting from public feedback and whether that's achieving equity goals or not. Public feedback can be incredibly anti-growth. It can also be, hey, we need more housing for this type of underserved community. So there's good and bad with that. And how do we support cities through that? But then also, like, for example, financing decisions in terms of how a city is financing for public improvement projects, or how they're choosing to structure their SDCs and rates and things like that. And whether or not, what is the role of DLCD weighing in on how a city is planning for and financing either needed infrastructure for housing or affordable housing resources? We have cities with very constrained revenue realities, in our property tax system, and that vary widely around the state, and what's appropriate for one city based on what services they provide or don't provide, their ratepayer base, and all of those things. How is DLCD engaging in that, and how is that going to play out in the audit process?
That's a good question.
Ariel, do you have a good answer?
I don't think it's appropriate for DLCD specifically as an agency to make that decision. I don't think that expertise is within the land use planning system. I think it's related, and I don't think that, I think that these are all questions and all parts of a city strategy and solutions, but I don't know that it's going to always be appropriate for DLCD to be the decider there. I think there are some elements that remain local decisions, and I just don't see in the land use planning realm that authority existing in Goal 10, frankly.
It will be, I think Sean's correct. It is a very interesting question, and it will become I think a pivotal question as jurisdictions move through the audit process and the acceleration agreement process as well. And I would imagine that reasonable people could disagree not only on what's within control or without, but also what the remedy is. So what do you do about it? And I think it's probably unlikely that DLCD is going to have rigid rules that talk about all of the minutia of possibilities within and without control. And so what are alternatives that will give cities some certainty, but also enough wiggle room so that they can talk about their context? It's going to be a difficult nut to crack. Tom. Oh, I think you're mute.
On that last point, I think DLCD does have a role to play in sort of highlighting best practices or level setting as to what is reasonably expected of cities. Like speaking to Anne's staffing capacity, like, okay, cities from 50 to 75,000, what's reasonable expectation? Like, you should have 2 planners working on this issue. These 10 cities figured out how to fund that. You are understaffing your planning program. There's some local responsibility there to not ignore the issue. And I think DLCD could offer a lot about, hey, these other cities figured out this is what they do. And it's not just like pointing to Portland or whatever, but, cities that are in the same boat. I think Ariel also brings up a good point, like say SDC reform or controlling SDC costs when you have a jurisdiction that has a lot of special districts. And how do they not just be part of the conversation, but what enforcement authority does DLCD have on them to like, hey, stop jacking up the rate. You know, they need to, I don't know what that angle is. The flip side of that, and it gets back to this best effort, is I think there needs to be a different standard and a different conversation when we're talking about affordable housing. And the expectation around the 0 to 60 AMI production, because unless the subsidies are there, we're not producing it. And we can explore different machinations about filtering and overproducing and producing the larger number. But I think there's something that we got to be around here, that lack of affordable production, or even sort of lack of, there needs to be a minimum standard like SDC waivers or density bonuses or something like that. And then, okay, does everybody need to do inclusionary housing? Does everybody need to pass a bond issue? I mean, I feel like Portland is doing all that we can. We're not going to hit our targets in terms of production in that, so I don't know where we go under best effort with that, but we're doing what we can, and we're not going to come close, because we've got 10% regulated affordable and a 40-50% need. We're not going to be able to buy our way out of this. So I think that's where we need more technical assistance or whatever, or overproducing on the high end. And I think that's where it's going to have to be more on the best effort line than actual production numbers.
Yeah, and I think the good news story, Tom, is that, right, it's making progress towards the targets, because I think we're all on the same page that it's going to be maybe a couple generations for us to get there. Yeah, so enough on that, I suppose. Ariel.
Thanks. I really appreciate all your points, Tom. I do have to follow up on a couple of things, though. I definitely agree that these are conversation points that are appropriate for DLC to have. And in terms of best practices, level setting, what are other similar size cities doing? I think that's kind of what you're talking about for the production numbers. But at the same time, what is an appropriate staffing level, planning staffing level, appropriate conversation to have. But you've also got to consider there are going to be wide disparities, even between similarly sized cities in property tax base. I mean, we've got Gresham with one of the lowest property tax bases in the city. Should they be compared to a similar sized city that has different resources? Washington County and gain share and the resources in that county and those cities are vastly different than large cities of similar sizes in other counties. So again, DLC is going to have a lot of education on that, I think, on the staff end, to be sensitive to and aware of those differences. I don't know that we can require every city to waive SDCs, based on their ratepayer base and other ways. They still have to pay for the infrastructure some way. So just want to put that flag out there. Got 241 cities. There are very, very wide disparities and differences on resources. So just wanted to flag that.
I actually, I have a question as a follow-up to that. So one of the things that we have to consider as part of the audit process is this idea that we are evaluating also like the local capacity side of the equation. So like, what is a city working with, right? In terms of not only their staffing, but just like thinking about those resource bases, right? And that could be part of that evaluation. Is that something that should be explicit, and like maybe like part of the audit always includes an evaluation of like, all right, what is the city working with? What are, their various taxation situations, their total budget, with their total staff capacity, all those different pieces. So that way we can do a nuanced evaluation of like, all right, when we're thinking about the realm of everything that's inside of city's control, we have a clear picture of what they're working with, right?
Yeah, and I think that it's going to be important that it's not, that burden is not on the city to prove it, that the state should take an equal partnership role in helping with that assessment. I think it will help a lot if cities aren't feeling like they have to say, but that they're, if it's just you're saying a built-in part of the assessment, a part of that process, I think will be helpful. I think I think it will also be a really valuable tool for state education, period, in terms of what local governments are facing. But I think it's going to point to, this is one of the fundamental reasons why we have local control. It's not just because cities don't want the state to tell them what to do. It's because they're all in very unique positions, and the state has not been currently in a position, and I don't see it time soon. I'm not speaking of DLC, but just generally to know what is best for a city when they're dealing with so many competing factors right now. Doesn't mean we can't have the conversation. It doesn't mean we can't, the state shouldn't be asking cities to kind of follow those best practices and look at what the options are. But we've got to be really careful when we're getting down to what individual cities are expected to be doing with every tool.
For sure. Yeah, no, I think that context is really important.
Michael.
I want to echo Ariel's point that there's some things that DLCD definitely should have the ability to evaluate, and some things that it shouldn't really be directly evaluating. I like Tom's point about safe harbors as a way to navigate some of that tension. And then also to Tom's point about the impossibility of hitting the below market production targets. Yeah, I was just, again, like Kaden said, it's progress toward, and that's what it is all built around. Yeah, thanks.
The other thing on that, Michael, is right. The audit talks about all of the things that may be contextualizing what's in the city's control, but then there are a list of things that are outside the city's control. And the more audits that we have with findings that show a deficiency in funding for 0 to 60% AMI housing, that's a pretty clear indicator to the state and other organizations that we need to do more if we are gonna dig ourselves out of that hole. Barb.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Ariel said about different finances in different cities. You could have your best intentions to stimulate development of different types of housing, but if the market doesn't cooperate, even if you have the similar zoning or even better zoning, you're not going to produce what you anticipate producing. The other aspect of the financing that is difficult is if over 70% of your city is already residential and your AV is coming, your assessed valuation is coming from 70% or more residential zoning, it is very difficult to make your city function well over time. So that is a factor that will affect whether a city remains financially solvent or not.
Thanks, Barbara. Al.
A couple of things that have to do with the assessment of what is in and what's not in a local jurisdiction's control. And I agree with Ariel. There's a tremendous amount of variation, and the real question is, what do you do with that? Who calls out what is in control and what is not, and who makes the call on whether or not that's a persuasive case? And one example is like Bend and Eugene. Bend has a separate Parks and Recreation District, which is very, very well funded, very, very popular, and is very, very wary of getting involved in anything having to do with housing. So they're totally unhelpful on that because that doesn't help their main program. Eugene, similar sized city, Parks and Recreation is inside the city as a department. And so it doesn't have that kind of independence. And so it's part of a balancing process that doesn't apply over in Bend. I think that probably is replicated clear across the state. The other example I would give would be how things go from being out of a city's control and then coming into a city's control. And there, I've been working for years on affordable housing solutions in the city of Bandon, where they have a very large area with about, just a whole lot of capacity, but it has not been able to be annexed. And so it took them 15 years, but finally, the city managed to surround that, and now it can. So it wasn't in their control, and now it is. That kind of information is the kind of thing that is really in the control of the jurisdiction, and the jurisdiction should be responsible for making their case that something is or isn't in its control. But then it may be for the agency or for someone else to make an assessment and say, yeah, we're persuaded, or here's an alternative. So there's that kind of a process you have to think about.
Thank you.
Also, yeah, just really quickly. So after Sam's comment, something I want to pivot to, something a lot of folks have raised, which is the role of other public bodies, I'll say, because that's called out in the statute. And it's also an area that's ambiguous. And I think one of the things that we want to explore is like, where does it make sense? How do we structure that in the audit process? And of course, thinking through where the limitations of where DLCD's authority begins and ends, I think is an important one. But yeah, no, Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, this is less of a structural one. I'm just trying to be predictive of the kinds of things that are going to come up as things that are outside of city's control. We saw this during the middle housing piece, HOAs and CC&Rs. I think it definitely depends on the city, but certain cities, it is going to come up as something that is throttling the ability of cities to meet their housing goals. And we're probably going to have a statewide conversation about that at some point.
I just wanted to add to that, at least one city I'm aware of also has some odd commercial CC&R covenants built in that are really hampering their ability to do redevelopment and mixed use redevelopment. So just something to be aware of in that category.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, so if we can pivot just a little bit. So I want to talk just maybe set this up a little bit. So there's an interesting role that is called out in the audit process, in the acceleration agreement, and overall about the role of other state agencies and other public bodies, which is intended to be inclusive of, say, like special districts, for example. And there's an interesting dynamic of like where DLCD's authority begins and ends. The first one that's very concrete and I think is worth discussing, we have some of our OHCS colleagues in the room. I actually, in starting these discussions during the legislative conversation, uncovered an old statute that essentially enables DLCD to request OHCS conduct a review of a city's Goal 10 program. It's like an existing statute that's on the books. And it made actually a lot of sense in this context. Like if DLCD is doing a deep dive, if there's this affordable housing nexus, it very likely could make sense that OHCS would do a concurrent review. So one question is, where does that make sense to loop them into the process? Because it's a may, it's not a shall. And then the second, like how should that look, right? And then the second part of the question is that there is this role that DLCD has in identifying other state agency programs and funding sources, to evaluate other public bodies, to get them into the room on like the audit process to talk through some of the barriers that type of thing. And there's this interesting piece of statute that really it's at the end of the statute, subsection 12. It says all public bodies, right, as they are, which is inclusive of state agencies, inclusive of special districts, they are directed to assist cities and the department in the performance of their duties under this section and to take timely action to ensure that the agency's rules or policies do not unduly delay the implementation of a housing acceleration agreement under this section. So obviously that part of that is the acceleration agreement. It stops short, right? DLCD does not have authority to tell ODOT how to spend their funding, right? That's obviously outside of our statutory authority. But one of the questions that I have in the relationship to the audit process is there is this clear expectation that it's more than just the cities, it is state agencies, it is special districts. They should be doing what they can to support. And how can we best roll them in? Like, how do we best structure this process to ensure that those voices are being brought in, that we're collaborating with those different state agencies and public bodies to at least make sure that we're setting up the process to evaluate that, right? And to fulfill at least that intent.
Right, Ariel, kick us off.
Yeah, I would love to get the statutory citation emailed when you have a chance, Sean, to have our attorneys look at it. Regardless, what you've just described, I thought was kind of the intent, and a big part of the owner report and into the legislative is that state housing production strategy. And so my understanding was that coordination was being worked on and it was going to be part of this. It was getting built into the HAPO. And so I would hope that is happening. And that coordination is part of, regardless of what statute you have covered or how it relates, I would hope that it doesn't. What I wouldn't want is like simultaneous processes. There should just be one process that the city is having to deal with, led at DLCD with the other agencies built in, which is, I thought, where we were heading. And it needs to be really transparent for the city. The state needs to be equally transparent in what it's doing as this city is required to be in its housing production strategy and how it, if there's a plan B, plan C, those kinds of things. So I would just hope that it's very clear. And that if there are, potentially other authorities, I mean, certainly other expertise is welcome, but again, we want to be really clear what the authority is of DLCD or any other agency involved in the process to dictate what a city must have in its HPS, what is within or outside its control. So as long as we just need to be really clear about that. And
For sure.
streamline it as much as possible, so the city's not having to go between different agencies and there's not new processes being tacked on here and there. I would hope that it's just integrated. We would, like to see that happen through DLCD and through this process.
Oh yeah, totally. And I should mention, yeah, right. The owner recommendation was a recognition that the state has a role in addressing the housing portion of the piece, specifically on the funding side, as well as the statewide coordination through, right, some type of coordinated statewide entity that is focused on housing production. You might remember, right, the House Bills 2001 and 2889 did not establish those comprehensively, at least. I think that there is a lot of work that's happening in terms of trying to seed those conversations too. We know that there's obviously a lot that's moving on the governor's office side of things to try to build that concept into this, but I think we should be pretty transparent, right? That this coordinated statewide entity was not included in House Bill 2001 or 2889. So what we're working with here is this: we have this audit process, we have this direction to include these different public bodies. Obviously, we don't want to make duplicative processes, and we should work to avoid that in the rule. But we do have this kind of direction to at least get them to the table. So how do we structure that? That's what I'm trying to really trying to get at here, right? Knowing that we are still working towards, as a state, having this coordinated statewide entity, but it doesn't exist yet, right?
Okay, Al.
Well, it's a question for Sean, I think. Will state agencies have to update their state agency coordination agreements to coordinate with the new entity when it comes online? And is the state agency coordination process part of this overall process we're talking about, can be somehow incorporated into it?
I think you guys are asking questions about a policy or structure that doesn't exist. I can't answer these questions.
You don't know what state agency coordination is?
No, I understand what state agency coordination is. There is no policy direction in House Bill 2001-2889 to state agencies saying thou shalt coordinate and revise your IAAs. That was not part. That was one of our recommendations.
I got that, but that's right in the statute that says state agencies shall coordinate. This is an pre-existing statute. We didn't need to have it in the new statute, would be my point on it.
You got to go back to Senate Bill 100 and the foundational legislation that says state agencies will coordinate.
Yeah, and they spent, all during the 1980s, the state agency coordination process was just absolutely a central difficult issue that the agency and all the agencies were dealing with. And at some point, it just kind of got behind, but it's obviously not an unfunded mandate since it's horizontal and not vertical. So just kind of thinking to myself, I don't know if Ariel's got a thought about that.
I'm just kind of similarly, there's nothing preventing state agencies from coordinating right now, whether it's formal or informal, whether the governor directs it through executive order. And I think arguably there are some pieces of her existing executive orders that you could potentially point to that would get us there. So I don't know that we need to get hung up on the authority. I was going to say, I'm supporting everything Al just said. I was just going to say, I think there are existing barriers for cities right now to housing production coming from competing state agency timelines, things you've heard us talk about in many work groups and spaces. But just for example, I think that we need to have a much stronger connection between the available infrastructure resource at the IFA and Business Oregon, and those timelines need to much better line up with the affordable housing development timelines, with the HPS timelines. If a city is getting a warning from DEQ that their stormwater permits, they're facing a moratorium, it shouldn't just be, oh, here's your moratorium, and then the city's like, okay, where do I go? We've got regional solutions, but there should be a direct connection that if you've got something that's keeping you from developing housing, or it's going to cost you a lot more, your SCCs are going to go way up because you've got to get in line with regulatory, federal and state regulations. We just need those connections made. And so I think cities shouldn't have to chase, around 3, 4, 5 different agencies to put these pieces together. We're just looking for the agencies to do that. And to Al's point, I think that authority exists. I don't think it takes a new program.
Right. And I'll just say, I agree again with all of these points. This is why we recommended it, right? But I think we need to bring the conversation back to specifically operationalizing the statute, and we need to think very critically about like what we have control or not control over. That's a huge, giant yacht that we are trying to turn. Like I think collectively as a state, we are trying to turn the ship on. Again, our rules are not going to do that. So
Okay,
let's
what
bring
are
it
you
back.
asking
What
us
we
to do?
can
You asked us
control.
how it should look, what we thought it should look like through the process. You said you uncovered some authority from OHCS, at least specific to affordable housing.
Right, exactly. And so that's one that is embedded explicitly in the statute, right? It references specifically DLCD may reach out to OHCS and request a concurrent review. That's one of the examples of like this broader coordination strategy. I think we're trying to get into this broader, like all the state needs to be coordinated. We agree with that. That's why we recommended it. But again, that's a big effort that is like, again, beyond the scope and the direction of the
Okay,
rulemaking process that we have
I
in
guess
front
what
of
I'm
us.
saying is, I don't know why it has to be a formal request for OHCS to do this formal process. It seems like they're just going to be at the table. It's this kind of, a joint agency effort. And, they're going to be co-reviewing HPSs as it relates to affordable housing and available resources and what they understand is their pipeline coming in for funding and, how it relates to their QAP and the census tract designations from HUD that are guiding the resources. I just assumed that was kind of happening and that we wouldn't need to trigger some uncovered statute, that this would just be kind of built into the process.
It could be, right? If the answer is OHCS should be involved on every single audit process, then that could be the answer, right? We have that discretion to define that in the rule. That's why I asked the question.
I mean, every HPS is going to require a look at those affordability levels that OHCS serves. And to Tom's point, if the resources aren't there, there's only so much a city can do. And currently the OHCS funding process does not have a path in for cities to have a meaningful impact on the resources that are coming to their community, unless they are proactively working with developers, unless they have developers already in their community. It is pretty difficult to, and there's best practices and ways they can be supportive and, help put things forward for the application, if they've got land, all of those things. But in terms of actually ensuring they are scoring and they're getting the resources, that they're not currently built into the OHCS process. And so my assumption was that is coming, and it's going to be kind of coming along with how the ONA is getting built out. So I would hope, and if a city goes into the audit process, I imagine most cities are not going to be performing on affordable housing due to the constraint of resources. And so OHCS is going to need to be part of that conversation regardless. So yeah, I guess in that capacity, they would need to be involved.
Sean, just factually, are we assuming that OHCS will be reviewing housing production strategies as they're being developed?
So in the standard HPS review process, right, which is set forth in statute, the reviewing entity and the entity that makes the decision on the HPS is DLCD. And the acceleration program is something that pulls into an existing statutory authority, essentially to request concurrent review by OHCS. It's something that we can draw from. We can design the rules to for example, always have concurrent OHCS review alongside or it could be more targeted, right? Maybe, for example, in the context of lackluster affordable production, that might be a more relevant, right, kind of use of that authority. And of course, obviously, OHCS's time and capacity too, which is also limited to alongside DLCDs. But I think the broader element is there is this desire and this long-term effort for structuring this to be a more coordinated effort by the state. And how can we design the rules, at least to set up the process for this particular piece, to say, for example, if we hit and start seeing those barriers like, oh, there's this need for an additional wastewater facility. Oh, there's this need for additional transportation capacity, XYZ, those types of dollars. We actually have a meaningful process and structure in place that we can draw on those connections when they happen. But I think the idea that like OHCS does concurrent review of HPSs right now, that's just not the case. That's not what the statute says, and that's not how we've operationalized the rule.
Thank you. Ariel?
I guess I was hoping at a minimum that OHCS would have an awareness of what the allocation was for each city in terms of that's in the affordable range for OHCS resources, that they should have awareness that should help inform how they're designing their set asides and their allocations and their funding offerings. And that should also be coordinated with the other public funders in the metro region, right? And where we have like home and stuff in Eugene and things like that. So to me, that was like a baseline, like at a minimum, they should be doing that. I know that's different, right, than an HPS review, but I do think there is room to explore, and I can't speak for OHCS's capacity, right, but for what role they would play as it relates to the affordable resources. I would also, and not just the rental resources, but the affordable home ownership programs that they have there. And when it comes to, permanent supportive housing, so all of that stuff. I also just wanted to flag, there are examples for this. My understanding, I don't know if it still happens, but OHCS had a role in the PAPA review process. They were part of that group of folks that gets together and looks at those. So it's not, these things happen all the time. I don't know how formal it needs to be in the rule. I just think it needs to be transparent and clear and predictable for the agency too, for their staff management and capacity management. So, to me, at the minimum, they need to have an awareness of what each city is being told they need to do and also from my vantage point for cities, like, as I said, having cities to have when a city says, okay, we have this allocation, how do we go make sure we can get funding? How do we, because right now it's a developer that goes and chases the funding. It's not a city. And we're not saying that cities are going to be developers, right? But so yeah, I guess just to reiterate, there's got to be that coordination at the minimum. And then in terms of the HPS review, I think there's room and at potential situations where it will be appropriate for them to be involved. But I think we have to know a little bit more about how that audit process works to say specifically what OHCS would or wouldn't be doing or what would be appropriate. And they may have ideas.
Thank you, Ariel. Sam, are you responding to something Ariel said? No.
I'll let Love respond. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Love, can you please?
Yes, thanks everyone. Hi, my name is Love Johnson. I'm with OHCS, been here about 6 months. Just want to chime in a little bit on all this. I think we're all in very early days conversation about everything, but I definitely agree with you, Ariel, that there really should be sort of one point of contact in DLCD, and the new HAPA office will be leading that and will be involved. We're not currently scoped capacity-wise to be able to be doing that deep dive review of every single HPS, but we're definitely tracking production needs. I'm sure many of you are aware we're kind of in the process of redesigning our entire funding process. So we're moving from individual NOFAs for each funding program towards one centralized application for affordable housing funding. And as part of that, we are creating new set-asides. And one of those set-asides for funding is geographic, and it's based specifically on the need numbers that are coming from the ONA. So those are at the regional level. As it stands now, once you get into smaller geographies, like if we were to try to go city by city based on need, it becomes very tricky because, like you mentioned, Ariel, there's not development capacity in those cities. And so until we can build up the capacity, we would sort of artificially be holding resources back for a certain period of time, which slows down production and doesn't help meet, the governor's office goals for production and all of our goals for production and sort of efficiency. So there's that. OHCS also does have capacity building programs, which are strengthening. They're kind of growing. We'll be having more funding as well. Those are offered both as grants and as loans. And so, newer developers in these smaller jurisdictions will be able to apply for funding for those as well. And all of our funding through this redesign should be offered more efficiently. And that's going to launch pretty soon here within the next couple of weeks. So that's kind of where things stand now. Sean, I would be interested in reading that piece of old statutes you found. I think we just all need to have a little bit more information and are looking forward to working together on all this.
Thank you, Love.
Can I just jump in real quick too, to hear, to just recognize that I totally hear Ariel's point. And I think that, we really do just need to build in some clarity about when that OHCS review is triggered. At this point, like you're hearing, they're not, the OHCS does not review the HPS, the HPSs. And to whatever extent that's part of the referral process. I think we just need to build that in a really clear way. What that looks like is, again, like kind of just forming, but I think that understanding sort of the need to coordinate deadlines, coordinate deliverables from cities to agencies. I think that's all kind of part of the world that we're looking at. So anyway, I think in terms of that element of what you're saying, Ariel, I think I totally hear you, and it's going to be important to reflect that in these rules.
All right, thank you. Sam.
Yeah, so far we've only really talked about incorporating public bodies in terms of who would have impact regarding production and underproduction. Since failing on equity indicators is also a reason that cities would be referred. I do think that we have to plan to incorporate a body that would be that has more expertise on that would be responsible more for that. I would suggest whoever happens to be in charge of the consolidated plan, analysis of impediments, should be in the room. So whether that is a community development office within the city, if it's an entitlement jurisdiction, it could be, we have several entitlement counties. So it could be, if it happens to be Washington County or OBDD has responsibility for the balance of the state in terms of the AI. So because the AFFH, equity indicators were written to not duplicate what is already being done for the federal standards, I would say that those offices should absolutely be in the room to review whether a city is meeting its equity indicators.
Yeah, thank you. Ariel, your hand is up. Are you one? Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to respond to things that said first, fully support what Sam just shared. I would maybe less on Business Oregon. I think OHCS has taken more of a lead role on the consolidated plan as it relates to housing, but fully support what you were getting at there. And I guess I had that question earlier, but I didn't get to it, is, assuming that maybe DLCD was going to be taking a stronger role in terms of like furthering those equity goals, but OHCS does have their framework and their lenses for their affordable resources. So making sure we're coordinating there. And particularly when we're looking at the affordable housing goals and production targets, that OHCS has some requirements that go with that for developers that I'm hearing don't work as well in some rural communities. So having some understanding and awareness of those pieces and how those may impact the ability for OHCS resources to reach rural or communities or smaller towns that have not had OHCS resources. And I just wanted to be clear, because a lot of people are texting me. I think there's a difference. I think DLC's been articulating this in OHCS between, OHCS is not currently reviewing HPSs. I don't know that I'm suggesting that. That is a large body of work. I think DLCD largely has, it has that covered, but as it comes to cities being held accountable for specific housing targets at a specific affordability levels and specific types of housing, whether that be for people exiting homelessness, permanent sort of housing, the like, OHCS does have a role, and they do need to have an awareness. And while I appreciate that the regional targets are kind of built into the set-asides for OHCS's new process, that is not, and I think you alluded this a bit, Love, but that is not meaningful or actionable for the individual cities who will get their individual targets. The fact that we have everything east of the Cascades is in a region is cities are not appreciating that are over there, that, they're very differently situated, right? Their goals and barriers and opportunities are going to look very different. So we need to keep that in mind. But I'm also remembering, I think there are going to be ways for OHCS to incentivize this. They initiated, I think maybe it's called something different now, but scattered site scoring, such that when you had an urban developer, if they also applied with a companion rural site in a community that hadn't, had affordable development, they would get preferential scoring from OHCS, and their Portland or Eugene site would get a higher score because they tacked on a Umatilla or whatever with it. And they were able to do their cost margins in one development, so that, the rural affordable sites that are the margins are so much thinner and so much difficult to make pencil with the clunky affordable resources, they were able to package them together. So is there, I think that still exists at OHS, or I hope it does. I know it was pretty successful with the lift resources, but there's got to be a way for those cities that have a deep affordability need as identified in their HPS and in the ONA targets. If they haven't had funding, for them to get that incentive and for the scoring, I know it's a different scoring metric now and it's more open-ended, but for those kinds of preferences for OHS to kind of they need to be more coordinated, be building those kinds of incentives into their funding system. Or, if there are barriers when it comes to the certified contractor requirements now for OHCS through their, and that's less accessible for these communities, like they need to have a way in, and cities need to understand that they could potentially have a role to support that and build those processes in at the local level and encourage those so that they can be more attractive. And I don't see that built into the process right now. And I don't think it's going to happen in a passive way. So I think that's kind of what I'm urging for. And then again, back to what role does OHCS have in the audit? Regardless of I know that not all the agencies are formally directed by 2001, but I thought OHCS was. They're named in the statute. And so regardless of whatever authority you're actually using, just want to reiterate my point, it should just be built into the process. And I don't know that, I would like OHCS to be formally and informally involved when it comes to specifically for a city meeting their affordability and specific housing type goals that touch OHCS resources.
Right. And I guess what I was asking is how. Like, what does that look like? We have the flexibility.
Yeah, on one hand, you're saying you don't have the authority, and on the other hand, you're saying you do. So
no, we do. No, it's explicitly in the statute.
Okay.
So specifically what I'm referring to is ORS 197A.130. You can take a look at the policy brief. Subsection 5, sub A, it enables DLCD to request concurrent review of a city's measures and housing production strategies under ORS 197A.205. When you refer to that section, that is the authority that DLCD has to request that OHCS conduct review of Goal 10 plans and policies. So this is an explicit thing in statute. Like, it explicitly calls out there's going to be this role for OHCS. Where does it make sense to do that? That's kind of the question. It doesn't tell us how to do that. Right.
I guess I'm just assuming that, I think in terms of I think cities are going to be expected to remove barriers to affordable housing and to encourage it where they can. And that's where we get into the previous conversation of what's appropriate to require a city to do to encourage, because that's going to come down to capacity and financial constraints. I don't think OHCS has any more business than DLCD in saying what's more or less appropriate for a city until we get more defined in those authorities and what's appropriate. I go back to Tom's points of what are the best practices and how can you be thinking about this and guiding and providing TA. I'm just assuming that the biggest barrier for cities for a lot of this stuff is going to come down to resources. And so that's just, I think, the most logical place for OHCS to get involved. And then to Sam's point, how are the fair housing and the equity indicators? I think there's a really strong role for the agency to play there. I don't know that they bring any additional expertise on the other pieces of the HPS than is already at DLCD. And I don't speak up if that's not the case, but I think it's going to come down to like the programmatic availability, resource availability of what OHCS has within their house and the equity pieces and aligning those.
So we will have more time to talk about that next time when we talk about the acceleration agreement, because I think one of the directives to DLCD is to make its resources available and also to help locate other state resources that may also be available for housing production. And OHCS would be a logical partner to bring to the table in that regard. But I think also we're hearing sort of loud and clear from you, Ariel, that that not only are cities needing to remove barriers, but state agencies are also needing to remove barriers if we want to see the production goals met. And I think that that's landing with our state agency partners.
It's one we've heard a lot, and that's why we made sure it was explicitly part of the ONA recommendations.
So, Sean, I want to make sure we have about 11 minutes before we close. And are there other questions you want to make sure that we hit today?
I mean, Thea, feel free to chime in. I feel like this was pretty robust. I think we have a lot of the broad kind of questions and considerations around, thinking about that universe of like, how do we approach the audit? What are some of the major questions that we need to ask and answer? And I think what we have enough that we can at least, frame up a policy conversation, in my opinion, on the 30th with the RAC, and then start getting into some more specifics around like, all right, what are some specific ways we can structure this, right? To get these different voices that we've talked about in the room, to evaluate things, to really think critically about the context and thinking nuanced about, any given local government situation as unique as they are. But I don't know, Thea, if you wanted to add anything else to that.
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking through the questions that we have, and I think that we've touched on everything. This has really been a sort of broad-ranging conversation, and I think we've gotten a lot of really good ideas, and I think that we'll be able to, look back through our notes and condense this into something that, a series of questions that we can take to the RAC. I guess, just maybe to leave us with something to think about, again, to call back sort of the breadth versus depth tension, if that's something that y'all have had some more ideas about as we've talked through this, sort of how and where to focus the evaluation, starting to think about how to operationalize that. But I don't think we need to spend time on that right now, but I think it would be really helpful to have your brains on this, for the next several meetings. And feel free to keep dropping things into that Miro board. I've definitely seen a few more updates in there, and I really appreciate the thoughtful conversation that's going on there. So let's just keep it going. Yeah, so Sean, nothing specific.
So to Thea's point about breadth versus depth, next time we're going to be talking about the acceleration agreement process. And so and then we'll come back around to talk through all three steps again, but it will be interesting to revisit referral when we know now all of the components that are required statutorily for every audit, for every jurisdiction that's referred, and then the 6-month process for the acceleration agreement, at least at this point, statutorily required for every entity that is referred. They go through both of those subsequent pieces. And so even though the outcomes of the acceleration agreement will obviously vary depending on the jurisdiction, why they were referred, what they've been doing, et cetera, the process will remain the same. So when we come back around on the 23rd to talk about acceleration agreement, I think it will be good for all of us to keep that question of how many midpoint jurisdictions should be referred annually into that year-long process. And then I think before we close today, I just want to make sure that everybody has a last opportunity to make any last point that you'd like before we end today. All right, going once. Looks like you had enough. Oh, here we go. Thanks, Barbara.
Sorry, I just want to encourage that when you think about other state agencies, it's not just OHCS. We have a project that we approved 2 years ago, and they're still in ODOT review. And they went through DSL, they went through DEQ. Each different agency has spent almost a year with these different projects, this one project actually. And it's for 346 housing units. That's significant for our city, and it's still not approved through these different agencies. So when we think about different agencies, please think about other state agencies as well.
And definitely within the statutory intent. So no, that's a good point. Thank you.
All right, folks, thank you so much for your participation. Look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks. Have a good afternoon.